This is part 2 of the video on Nebuchadnezzar's reduction from being a man to being a beast. Verse 28. All this came upon King Nebuchadnezzar. At the end of 12 months he was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon. And the king answered and said, Is not this great Babylon, which I have built by my mighty power, as a royal residence and for the glory of my majesty? While the words were still in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven, O King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken. The kingdom is departed from you, and you shall be driven from among men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. And you shall be made to eat grass like an ox, and 7 periods of time shall pass over you, until you know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men, and gives it to whom he will. Immediately the word was fulfilled against Nebuchadnezzar. He was driven from among men, and ate grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till his hair grew as long as eagle's feathers, and his nails were like birds' claws. As one of the commentators say, the sense of achievement that Nebuchadnezzar here expresses is severely understated compared with the building inscriptions in Babylon, which occupy 126 pages of text in Langdon's edition of them. The palace from which he surveyed Babylon was one of the citadels on the north side of the city. It had large courts, reception rooms, throne room, residences, and the famous hanging gardens, a vaulted terrace structure with an elaborate water supply for its trees and plants, apparently built by Nebuchadnezzar for his Median queen. From the palace he would see in the distance the city's 27-kilometer outer double wall, which he had built. His palace stood just inside the double wall of the inner city, which was punctuated by 8 gates and encircled an area 3 kilometers by 1 kilometer, with the Euphrates running through the city. All right, so that's why this city was so impenetrable, because the water supply went under the wall into the city, and they grew food in the city and had a massive supply, and so nobody could take the city. The palace adjoined a processional avenue that Nebuchadnezzar had paved with limestone and decorated with lion figures, emblematic of Ishtar. This avenue entered the city through the Ishtar Gate, which he had decorated with dragons and bulls, which are emblems of the gods Marduk and Bel. The Ishtar Gate, which you can see here, has been moved to a museum in Berlin. It continued south through the city to the most important sacred precincts, to whose beautifying and development Nebuchadnezzar had contributed. The ziggurat, crowned by a temple of Marduk, where the god's statue resided. In Marduk's temple there were also shrines to other gods, and in the city elsewhere temples of other Babylonian gods restored or beautified by Nebuchadnezzar. Right, so the ziggurat, that's what the Tower of Babel would have been. You can see it there in the back, that pyramid-like structure. Here's another rendering of it. Here are the archaeological remains of Babylon. Therefore, O king, let my counsel be acceptable to you. Break off your sins by practicing righteousness, and your iniquities by showing mercy to the oppressed, and there may perhaps be a lengthening of your prosperity. Now, practicing righteousness became a stock phrase for almsgiving in the Hellenistic period, and may here have a particular leaning toward the poor. The point seems to be reinforced by the phrase showing mercy to the oppressed right afterwards. And remember that in the last video, that when Nebuchadnezzar described his great tree, he said everybody was able to eat from it. But when Daniel described it, he said it had enough food for everybody to eat from it, hinting that there may very well be a distribution system for food that is unfair, and thus there is injustice in the Babylonian kingdom. All of this came upon King Nebuchadnezzar. At the end of 12 months, he was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon. And the king answered and said, Is not this great Babylon, which I have built by my mighty power, as a royal residence and for the glory of my majesty? While the words were still in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven. As Longman says, pride in the negative sense is a conception of one's self-worth that exceeds the bounds of propriety. In the Bible, as we'll see in the next section, those bounds are clearly associated with seeing our every achievement, status, and possessions as gifts from God. Now, the point against pride, which is clearly being made here with Nebuchadnezzar as a case in point, is one that is frequently discussed throughout Scripture. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. One's pride will bring him low, but he who is lowly in spirit will obtain honor. But if you will not listen, my soul will weep in secret for your pride. My eyes will weep bitterly and run down with tears because the Lord's flock has been taken captive. For all that is in the world, the desire of the flesh and the desires of the eyes and the pride of life is not from the Father, but is from the world. Behold, this was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and needy. Now, this last description in Ezekiel of Sodom, in the pride of Sodom, with their excess of food and not taking care of the poor and needy, this seems to be especially like Nebuchadnezzar. And I'm not going to take away the sexual sin of Sodom. Some people will use the Ezekiel passage to say that there was nothing wrong with the types of sex they were having in Sodom. I'm not one of those. But I will point out that if you simply make the story of Sodom as a polemic against gay people, you're missing the point, because pride, having excess, ease, not helping the poor and needy, by these standards, a great many people who name the name of Christ would be guilty of being sodomites in our modern context. Now, there is a major historical question here. Did this really happen? Did Nebuchadnezzar really lose his mind for 7 years? Well, there's a consensus in the scholarly world that says this story was actually originally about Nabonidus, not Nebuchadnezzar. Nabonidus is the last king of Babylon, and he took off to the desert for 10 years and left his son reigning in his place as a regent. And when Nabonidus is gone for 10 years, of course, this is going to lead to all sorts of speculations and potentially legends about what happened to him. Did he go crazy and run out into the wilderness? Well, scholars are going to say that's what took place, and that in time, the story of Nabonidus incorrectly got applied to Nebuchadnezzar. And that's what we have here in Daniel chapter 4. Now, here in a moment, we're going to look at this from another perspective that says this is not the case. But there's a pretty strong reason for thinking this, for thinking that the story in Daniel chapter 4 about Nebuchadnezzar was originally about Nabonidus. And it's because in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we find a very similar story to Daniel chapter 4 written about Nabonidus, the king of Babylon. And here it is. The words of the prayer which Nabonidus, king of Babylon, the great king, prayed when he was smitten with a bad disease by the decree of God in Tema. I, Nabonidus, with a bad disease, was smitten for 7 years, and since God set his face on me, he healed me, and as for my sin, he remitted it. A diviner, he was a Jew from among the exiles, came to me and said, Proclaim and write to give honor and exaltation to the name of God Most High. And I wrote as follows. I was smitten by a bad disease in Tema by the decree of the Most High God. For 7 years I was praying to the gods of silver and gold, bronze and iron, wood, stone, clay, since I thought that they were gods. All right, and then he ends up getting restored. Scholars suggest that the author of Daniel was familiar with this prayer, either by oral tradition or a written exemplar, but identified the seer as Daniel and used the name of the better-known king Nebuchadnezzar. And so, legends that came about concerning Nabonidus in his 10-year absence, you can see in the Dead Sea Scrolls. They eventually turn into, a 7-year period of time. A prophet comes along, is in the story, and then Daniel knows about this tradition, and he simply reapplies it to Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar as where it was originally Nabonidus and some unknown prophet. And this has been a very popular interpretation among scholars, and of course this would mean that Daniel 4 should not be understood historically. These are embellishments of the story of Nabonidus, which the author has applied to has applied to Nebuchadnezzar in a way that cannot be historically accurate. But look at what Lucas says as a retort. He says, there is a fragmentary cuneiform text that seems to refer to some mental disorder afflicting Nebuchadnezzar, and perhaps to his neglecting and leaving Babylon, and that tells of repentance for the neglect of worship of the gods. The existence of the non-biblical tradition about Nebuchadnezzar suggests that some caution is in order regarding the consensus that Daniel 4 must have originally been a story about Nabonidus that has been transferred to Nebuchadnezzar, especially since very little is known from the Babylonian sources about the last 30 years of Nebuchadnezzar's life. All right, so this text he is referring to, some say it's to a different Babylonian king that is being referred, Amel Marduk, but Wiseman says there are good reasons for thinking that it's a reference to Nebuchadnezzar. Now, if it is referring to Nebuchadnezzar, then we have evidence outside the Bible that Nebuchadnezzar had a mental problem and left Babylon. And if that is the case, then scholars have been wrong for thinking that this is a legend about Nabonidus that Daniel has inaccurately applied to Nebuchadnezzar. And so Lucas is definitely in the minority here, but it's not necessarily the case, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that Daniel 4 here is non-historical. There is evidence to suggest that Nebuchadnezzar did do something like this, and since so little is known of the final years of his life, it certainly can't be ruled out. And so Daniel 4 does exist within the realm of historical plausibility. What I would like to do with the rest of our time is talk about the way that Daniel chapter 4 has had such a massive influence on the book of Revelation. Let his mind be changed from a man's, and let a beast's mind be given to him, that is, to Nebuchadnezzar here in Daniel 4:16. This inspires the language in Revelation 13, where John says, I saw a beast rising out of the sea, with 10 horns and 7 heads, and with 10 diadems on its horns and blasphemous names on its heads. And it was allowed to make war on the saints and to conquer them. Authority was given it over every tribe and people and language and nation. Now, Nebuchadnezzar also made war against God's people and conquered them, and he's also been discussed in this chapter as having authority over all sorts of people under heaven. Verse 30, the king answered and said, Is not this Babylon the Great, which I have built by my mighty power? Look at what Revelation says, talking about Mystery Babylon. And on her forehead was written a name of mystery, Babylon the Great. Right? Same phrase, picked right up out of Daniel chapter 4. Mother of prostitutes and of earth's abominations. And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints, the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. When I saw her, I greatly marveled. So Old Babylon was drunk with the blood of God's people, just as Mystery Babylon is in the book of Revelation. Now, the bestial theme of Nebuchadnezzar being reduced to the status of a beast is greatly developed in the book of Revelation, but there are some important differences as well. Nebuchadnezzar is eventually restored. Now, the beast in the book of Revelation is certainly not restored. He is cast into the lake of fire in Revelation 19. Nebuchadnezzar built Babylon the Great. Revelation's beast will destroy it. Right? Revelation 17 says here, and the 10 horns that you saw, they and the beast will hate the prostitute. They will make her desolate and naked and devour her flesh and burn her up with fire. That's language that goes back to Elijah and Jezebel, where Jezebel is eaten up by the dogs. So a lot of echoes of the Old Testament in the book of Revelation. If you have not been through my videos on the book of Revelation, I highly recommend it. And so the beast destroys Mystery Babylon in Revelation. That is certainly a development that does not show up in the original text in the book of Daniel. So Revelation is kind of staying in the same lane and trajectory established by Daniel, but it develops far beyond anything that the author of Daniel could have ever anticipated. There is a numerical puzzle introduced in relationship to the beast in the book of Revelation that is not in Daniel. This calls for wisdom. Let the one who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. It says that 666 is a number of a man. As New Testament scholars have known for a long time, Caesar Nero, who was the first Caesar to kill Christians, his name in Hebrew adds up to being 666, which is why 666 is the number of a man. It also says it's the number of the beast. Well, the word beast in Greek is therion, which also calculates to 666 in Hebrew. 666 is also the value of the false teachers early on in the book of Revelation, the Nicolaitans. And when 666 is written out with Hebrew letters, it spells a word that literally means you should destroy. Now in Daniel chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar's this bad guy. He's done bad things to God's people, etc. There's a certain sort of trajectory as to what the beast should be. But this numerical puzzle that is added to the mix in the book of Revelation, there is nothing like this in the book of Daniel. This is definitely Revelation taking some seminal material in Daniel and developing it tremendously. In the book of Daniel, you have a bestial downgrade contrasted with angelic upgrade. That is, in Daniel 4, Nebuchadnezzar is reduced from a man to the status of a beast. In Daniel chapter 7, the people of God are upgraded from being merely humans to being discussed as though they are members of the heavenly council. Now, you have something similar in the book of Revelation, but again, Revelation is going to develop it much, much further. The city, New Jerusalem, is measured in Revelation 21, and it says that it's 144 cubits by human measurement, which is also an angel's measurement. Now, notice here that when it comes to the city of God, human measurement and angelic measurement get intertwined. And 144 is also the number that points back to God's martyrs, and the 144,000 in Revelation 7 and 14. If you don't know that those are martyrs, if you have some other view, I encourage you to watch my videos on the 144,000 and I will fix your bad thinking. And also, this is part of this numerical puzzle. Just as 666 is the value for the word beast after we transliterate it into Hebrew, 144 is the numerical value for the word angel. So 144,000 is used of those who conquer in God's name, who conquer on heaven's behalf. And so, like Jesus said in the resurrection, we shall be like the angels. Revelation encapsulates this teaching with this numerical device by allowing those who give their lives for Christ to be characterized by a number which can be equated with the angelic or heavenly existence. At the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my reason returned to me, and I blessed the Most High, and praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, and he does according to his will among the host of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand or say to him, What have you done? At the same time, my reason returned to me, and for the glory of my kingdom, my majesty and splendor returned to me. My counselors and my lords sought me, and I was established in my kingdom, and still more greatness was added to me. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, for all his works are right, and his ways are just, and those who walk in pride he can put down. I have nothing to say about this except that Nebuchadnezzar's education is finally complete. In the first chapter, Nebuchadnezzar's education begins, and he's a slow student. All the magicians, he has access to them, but he finds that the three Jewish boys, plus Daniel, are wiser than all the pagans. But he doesn't take a clue from that the worship and service of idols is no good. So in chapter 2, his education continues. He has a dream where he represents the head on a statue that is destroyed. And instead of being humbled by this, in the very next chapter, he builds a statue where the whole thing is of gold, the same element that represented his kingdom in the previous chapter. And even after Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego are delivered from the furnace, his education is still not complete. He had tried to protect his idol with the threat of death. Either worship my idol or you'll be killed. Well, after he is persuaded of the strength of Yahweh, he begins to treat Yahweh as though he were an idol. He says that uh, anyone who says anything against Yahweh, I'm going to put him to death. Well, have you not learned? Yahweh is not like the idols. He doesn't need your protection the way that your idols did. And so we have this final chapter where Nebuchadnezzar is firmly put in his place. And we can tell by his concession here at the end that his education is complete. He finally gets it. God does not need him. The gods are not like Yahweh. He has finally been humiliated and humbled. And so his education is complete. And now in the next chapter, Daniel will move on to another king.